She sat quietly in the back of the veterans' meeting, picking at her quinoa salad while the others joked about rabbit food and questioned how anyone could survive without meat. They saw her as weak, soft, someone who'd lost her edge since leaving the Corps. But when 3 Marines lay bleeding on a mountain trail 5 miles from the nearest road, what happened next would shatter every assumption they'd ever made about strength. By the time Sarah Martinez reached that hospital, carrying her 3rd wounded Marine on her back, the people who had mocked her diet would never question her power again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Martinez moved through the Veterans of Foreign Wars meeting hall like a ghost, her worn canvas messenger bag slung over one shoulder, her footsteps barely audible against the scuffed linoleum floor. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet precision that marked her as former military, though her slight frame and gentle demeanor seemed to contradict the intensity that occasionally flashed in her dark eyes. 3 years since her discharge, and she still felt like an outsider in her own community. The meeting had just ended, another session of the South Bay Veterans Support Group, and Sarah was methodically packing away her notebook when she heard the familiar snickers from across the room. She didn't need to look up to know they were talking about her lunch again. The same quinoa and vegetable bowl she brought every Thursday. The same conversation that followed her wherever veterans gathered. "I swear, Martinez, you're gonna blow away in the next strong wind," called out Captain Jake Morrison, Rhett, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone he'd used since her first meeting 3 years ago. Jake stood 6'2" with shoulders that still strained against his polo shirt, his graying buzz cut and permanent scowl marking him as someone who'd never quite figured out how to be a civilian. "How'd you even make it through boot camp eating grass?" A chorus of chuckles erupted from his usual circle, mostly men in their 40s and 50s, who seemed to find endless entertainment in questioning Sarah's dietary choices. To them, her vegetarianism wasn't just a personal preference. It was a symbol of everything wrong with the new generation of service members, a sign of weakness that had no place in military culture. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she continued packing her things with the same methodical care she'd learned to apply to everything in her life. Her thermos went into the side pocket, her notebook into the main compartment, her pen clipped to the inside flap. Each movement was precise, controlled, a small act of dignity in the face of their ongoing mockery. "Leave her alone, Jake," came a voice from near the coffee station. Lisa Chun, a Navy veteran who'd lost her right leg to an IED in Afghanistan, shot him a disgusted look while refilling her mug. "Some of us are trying to maintain our girlish figures." "I'm just saying," Jake continued, his voice getting louder as he sensed an audience. "Back in my day, Marines ate meat. Real food. You needed that protein, that strength. How you gonna carry a wounded teammate when you're running on lettuce and good intentions?" The room fell quieter at that last comment, the way conversations do when someone crosses a line they didn't know existed. Sarah's hands stilled for just a moment, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. She'd heard variations of this particular attack before, the suggestion that her diet somehow made her less capable, less reliable, less of a Marine than the rest of them. Dr. Amanda Foster, the group's facilitator, cleared her throat from the front of the room. "Jake, I think we've covered this topic enough for one session." Her voice carried the practiced calm of someone who'd spent years managing group dynamics among traumatized veterans. "Sarah's dietary choices are her own business." But Jake wasn't finished. He'd had a few beers before the meeting. Sarah could smell it on him from across the room, and alcohol had a way of stripping away what little filter he possessed. "I'm just worried about unit cohesion, Doc. What happens when the chips are down? When someone's life depends on real strength, not whatever you get from tofu and spinach." Sarah finally looked up, her dark eyes meeting Jake's bloodshot stare directly. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her response. She'd been coming to these meetings for 3 years, enduring the same jokes, the same questions, the same dismissive attitudes. Part of her wanted to walk away, to find a different group, maybe one where former service members didn't feel the need to constantly prove their worth through outdated concepts of masculinity and strength. Instead, she stood slowly, shouldering her bag with practiced ease. "I guess we'll find out if it ever comes to that," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough edge to remind everyone present that she'd worn the same uniform they had, earned the same eagle globe and anchor that decorated Jake's baseball cap. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, charged with the kind of tension that comes when unspoken hierarchies are challenged. Sarah had served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, but her quiet demeanor and unconventional lifestyle choices had somehow diminished her credibility in the eyes of her fellow veterans. They saw her vegetarianism as weakness, her gentleness as an inability to handle the harsh realities of military life. What they couldn't see was the way her hands remained steady when others shook, the way her breathing stayed controlled when others hyperventilated during particularly intense group sessions. They didn't notice how she always positioned herself near the exits, how her eyes automatically cataloged potential threats and escape routes, how her posture remained alert even in relaxation. These were the habits of someone who'd seen combat, who'd operated in environments where a moment's inattention could mean death. As Sarah walked toward the exit, she passed by a bulletin board covered with flyers for various veterans' activities, hiking groups, bowling leagues, volunteer opportunities at local schools. Her eyes lingered on one particular flyer, a weekend camping trip organized by the Marine Corps League, designed to help veterans reconnect with nature and each other. The mountains of Big Sur, 2 days of hiking and campfire stories, a chance to rebuild the bonds that military service had forged. She'd been thinking about signing up for weeks, but Jake's constant harassment had made her hesitate. The last thing she needed was to be trapped in the wilderness with people who saw her as a liability, who questioned her strength and commitment based on what she chose to eat. But as she stood there, listening to the continued murmur of conversation behind her, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her phone and quickly typed a text to the organizer, Robert Sterling, confirming her spot on the weekend trip. If Jake Morrison wanted to question her capabilities, if he wanted to test whether lettuce and good intentions could measure up to traditional Marine strength, then she'd give him that opportunity. What Sarah didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in just 2 weeks, on a mountain trail 30 miles from the nearest hospital, Jake Morrison's question would be answered in the most dramatic way possible. 3 Marines would be wounded, help would be hours away, and the woman they'd mocked for her dietary choices would prove that true strength comes from places they'd never thought to look. As she pushed through the glass doors into the California evening, Sarah Martinez had no idea that she was about to become the kind of hero whose story would be told for generations. All she knew was that she was tired of being dismissed, tired of having her worth questioned by people who confused volume with strength, aggression with capability. The mountain trail was calling, and Sarah Martinez was ready to answer. The alarm clock on Sarah's nightstand read 5:47 a.m. when her eyes opened, 3 minutes before it was set to ring. Old habits from the Corps died hard, and her internal clock still operated on military precision even after 3 years of civilian life. She lay still for a moment in her small apartment, listening to the familiar sounds of her neighborhood, waking up the distant hum of traffic on Interstate 5, the bark of Mrs. Rodriguez's ancient chihuahua next door, the steady rhythm of her own breathing that had become a meditation in itself. Sarah's apartment reflected the same minimalist discipline that governed every aspect of her life. The furniture was sparse but functional, a single bed with military-precise corners, a small dining table that doubled as a desk, a bookshelf lined with veterinary textbooks and philosophy texts in equal measure. The only decorations were a few. Photographs, her graduation from boot camp, her squad in Afghanistan, and a faded picture of her grandmother. Tending a vegetable garden in Salinestadt, she moved through her morning routine with the same methodical precision she displayed at the veterans meeting. 20 minutes of yoga on a worn mat in the living room, focusing on poses that helped manage the chronic pain in her left shoulder. Souvenir from an IED blast outside Kandahar that had earned her a Purple Heart and an early discharge. 30 minutes of meditation, sitting cross-legged on a cushion, practicing the breathing techniques that had become her lifeline during the worst of her PTSD episodes. The kitchen ritual came next, and this was where Sarah's true passion revealed itself. She moved between the refrigerator and countertop like a chef in a high-end restaurant, assembling ingredients with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to field stripping and M4 rifle. Fresh spinach from the farmer's market, quinoa she'd cooked in bulk on Sunday, roasted chickpeas seasoned with turmeric and paprika, avocado sliced with surgical precision. Each component carefully measured, perfectly balanced for optimal nutrition and sustained energy. This wasn't just about avoiding meat, though her decision to become vegetarian had been a profound one. Made during her second deployment, when she'd spent 3 days trapped in a bombed-out building with a wounded goat that reminded her of the pet she'd had as a child. It was about taking control of the one thing she could control in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. Food was fuel, yes, but it was also medicine, comfort, and a daily act of self-care that helped keep the demons at bay. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Foster. "Don't let Jake get to you. Your strength shows in ways he'll never understand." Sarah smiled slightly as she packed her lunch. Amanda had become more than just a group facilitator over the past 3 years. She'd become a trusted mentor who understood that healing took many forms. That strength wasn't always measured in how much weight you could lift or how loudly you could shout. The drive to her job at the San Diego Humane Society took her through neighborhoods that told the story of her city's complex relationship with its military community. Past the sprawling base housing where young Marines lived with their families, through downtown where homeless veterans gathered under freeway overpasses, and finally to the modest building where she spent her days caring for animals that, like many veterans, had experienced trauma and needed patience to heal. Sarah's official title was Animal Care Specialist, but her colleagues had quickly learned that her skills went far beyond what the job description required. She had an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that came from years of reading body language in high-stress situations, of knowing when to advance and when to retreat, when to show strength and when to offer comfort. The most aggressive dogs calmed under her steady presence. Cats traumatized by abuse learned to trust again through her patient, consistent care. "Morning, Martinez," called out Kevin Walsh, the facilities manager, as Sarah clocked in. "We've got a new arrival in. Kennel 12. German Shepherd mix, owner surrender. Pretty aggressive, bit 2 people at the intake yesterday. Think you can work your magic?" Sarah nodded, already mentally preparing for the encounter. Aggressive dogs were often her specialty, not because she was fearless. Fear was a useful emotion that kept you alive, but because she understood that aggression was usually fear wearing a different mask. She'd learned that lesson about herself during her first deployment, when she'd realized that her own carefully controlled demeanor was as much about managing her own fear as it was about projecting strength. The German Shepherd was indeed aggressive, snarling and lunging at the kennel door when Sarah approached. But she didn't recoil or respond with dominance displays the way some handlers might. Instead, she sat down cross-legged just outside the kennel, close enough to be present, but far enough away to respect the dog's space. She didn't speak, didn't make eye contact, didn't demand anything. She simply existed in the space, breathing steadily, projecting the kind of calm confidence that had once helped her talk down a traumatized Afghan interpreter who'd been ready to bolt into Taliban territory. 20 minutes later, the dog was lying down, still watchful but no longer snarling. By lunch break, he was taking treats from Sarah's hand through the kennel bars. By the end of her shift, she had him on a leash, walking calmly through the facility. "I don't know how you do it," said Maria Santos, one of the newer volunteers, watching in amazement. "That dog looked like he wanted to kill someone this morning." Sarah knelt down to scratch behind the dog's ears, noting the way his tail wagged. Tentatively, trust building one moment at a time. "He's not aggressive," she said quietly. "He's scared." Sometimes those look the same from the outside, but the response needs to be completely different. It was a lesson she'd learned about herself, about many of the veterans in her support group, about the world in general. People and animals acted out of their wounds, their fears, their unprocessed trauma. What looked like weakness to people like Jake Morrison was often the result of incredibly difficult choices. Survival strategies that had been necessary at one time but no longer served their purpose. During her lunch break, Sarah sat in the small employee garden behind the building, eating her carefully prepared meal while reading a text from her cousin. "Elena, heard you signed up for that camping trip. You sure that's a good idea? Those guys give you enough grief already." Sarah typed back slowly. Someone needs to show them that there are different kinds of strength. What she didn't add, what she kept to herself, was that she needed to prove it to herself as much as to them. 3 years of civilian life had softened some of her military edge, had taught her gentleness and patience and the value of choosing. Peace over conflict. But sometimes, late at night when the nightmares came, she wondered if Jake Morrison might be right. Had she lost something essential when she'd chosen a different path? Had her compassion made her weak? The camping trip would answer that question, one way or another. In the mountains of Big Sur, surrounded by the people who questioned her strength, Sarah Martinez would discover what she was really made of. And so would they. The Marine Corps League meeting room at VFW Post 2563 buzzed with the kind of aggressive camaraderie that Jake Morrison lived for. Folding chairs arranged in military precision, coffee brewing in industrial-strength urns, and the familiar smell of Old Spice and testosterone that had followed him through 22 years of active duty and 15 years of retirement. This was his domain, his kingdom of khaki and complaints, where his word carried the weight of rank and tradition. Jake stood at the front of the room, clipboard in hand, addressing the 23 Marines who'd signed up for the Big Sur camping expedition. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone who'd never quite figured out how to exist without subordinates to command. "Gentleman and lady," he added with a barely concealed smirk in Sarah's direction, "we've got 48 hours. In some of the most beautiful and challenging terrain California has to offer." The lady comment drew chuckles from his usual crew. Staff Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez, Rhett, a stocky man whose beer gut strained against his Marine Corps polo shirt, leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone watching his favorite TV show. Next to him sat Gunnery Sergeant Rick Dalton, whose permanent scowl had deepened over the years like lines carved by wind and disappointment. These men had served honorably, had answered their country's call, but civilian life had left them adrift, clinging to past glories and outdated notions of what strength looked like. "Now this isn't a Boy Scout camping trip," Jake continued, his eyes scanning the room with the intensity of someone conducting a pre-mission briefing. "We're talking 10-mile hikes through mountain terrain, sleeping under the stars, cooking over open fires, real Marine Corps stuff. I need to know that everyone here can pull their weight, because in the mountains, weakness gets people killed." His gaze lingered on Sarah, who sat in the back row with the same composed expression she wore during support group meetings. She'd learned long ago not to react to his provocations, not to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. But Jake wasn't finished making his point. "Which brings me to a concern I have," he said, setting down his clipboard and crossing his arms. "We've got someone on this trip whose idea of proper nutrition is rabbit food and tree bark. Now I'm not saying names, but when push comes to shove, when someone needs help on that mountain, I want to know that the person next to me has the strength that comes from real food, real protein, real Marine Corps values. The room fell uncomfortably quiet. Even Tommy Rodriguez shifted in his seat, recognizing that Jake was crossing a line from leadership into harassment. But Jake had built his post-military identity around being the alpha dog, the keeper of traditions, the man who said what others were thinking but didn't have the courage to voice. Sarah felt 22 pairs of eyes turned toward her, some curious, some sympathetic, most reflecting the same question Jake had voiced. Could she really be trusted when it mattered? She thought about standing up, about walking out, about finding a different group of veterans who might accept her as she was. Instead, she remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap, waiting for the moment to pass. "Jake," came a voice from the middle of the room. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, no relation to Tommy, despite the shared surname, cleared his throat before continuing. "With respect, I think we're here to support each other, not tear each other down." Mike was younger than most of the group, maybe 28, with the lean build of someone who still maintained his military fitness standards. He'd done 3 tours in Afghanistan and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd proven his worth in combat. "I appreciate the concern, Rodriguez," Jake replied, his tone suggesting he appreciated nothing of the sort. "But leadership means making hard decisions. It means acknowledging when someone might be a liability." He turned back to Sarah, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he might use with a child. "Martinez, I'm not trying to embarrass you. I'm trying to keep everyone safe. Maybe you should consider sitting this one out." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt the weight of every assumption, every stereotype, every doubt that had followed her through 3 years of veteran meetings. They saw her vegetarianism as weakness, her gentleness as inability, her choice to pursue healing over hardness as some kind of betrayal of Marine Corps values. What they didn't see was the way her pulse remained steady under pressure, the way her breathing stayed controlled, even as anger built in her chest like steam in a pressure cooker. They didn't know about the night patrols she'd led through Fallujah, the improvised explosive devices she'd helped disarm, the wounded Marines she'd dragged to safety while bullets cracked overhead. They knew her dietary choices. They didn't know her combat record. "I'll be there," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying just enough steel to remind everyone present that she'd earned her place in this room through the same blood, sweat, and sacrifice as any of them. Jake's jaw tightened. He'd expected her to back down, to excuse herself from the trip and validate his assessment of her character. Her refusal to be intimidated only reinforced his conviction that she needed to be put in her place, shown the consequences of abandoning traditional Marine Corps toughness. "All right then," he said, his voice taking on a theatrical quality that suggested he was enjoying this confrontation more than any mature leader should. "But when we're out there, when the going gets tough, don't expect special treatment. Don't expect anyone to carry your pack or slow down because you're running on quinoa instead of quality protein." Corporal Alex Thompson, a quiet man who'd lost his left leg below the knee to an IED in Helmand Province, spoke up from his wheelchair near the door. "Jake, maybe we should focus on the logistics instead of dietary choices. What's the weather forecast looking like?" It was a graceful attempt to redirect the conversation, and most of the room seemed grateful for the intervention. But Jake wasn't ready to let go of his moment of dominance. He'd positioned himself as the guardian of Marine Corps values, the man willing to speak hard truths, and backing down now would undermine the authority he'd worked so hard to establish. "The weather's going to be challenging," he said, finally turning away from Sarah, but keeping his voice pitched for maximum intimidation. "Rain predicted for Saturday night, temperatures dropping into the 40s. The kind of conditions that separate the Marines from the wannabes." Private Danny Walsh, the youngest member of the group at 24, raised his hand tentatively. "What should we bring for food? Are we cooking as a group or individually?" "Group cooking," Jake replied. "Tommy's bringing steaks for Saturday night. Rick's handling breakfast. I've got burgers for Friday." Real food for real Marines. He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering his final jab. "Though I suppose some people will have to make their own arrangements." The message was clear. Sarah was on her own, excluded from the group's communal meals, marked as an outsider who'd chosen to separate herself from the brotherhood through her dietary choices. It was petty, juvenile, and exactly the kind of behavior that drove good people away from veteran organizations. As the meeting broke up and Marines clustered in small groups to discuss logistics, Sarah remained in her seat, watching the social dynamics play out around her. She saw the way newer members deferred to Jake's authority, the way his inner circle fed off his aggression, the way even well-meaning Marines like Mike Rodriguez chose to avoid confrontation rather than challenge the established hierarchy. This was the culture she'd be entering in the mountains of Big Sur, a world where strength was measured by outdated metrics, where conformity was valued over character, where anyone who chose a different path was viewed with suspicion and contempt. Jake Morrison had made it clear that he saw her as a liability, a weak link that threatened the integrity of his carefully constructed Marine identity. What Jake didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in 48 hours, their understanding of strength, weakness, and Marine Corps' values would be shattered completely. The woman they'd dismissed as too soft, too weak, too different would prove that true strength comes not from what you eat, but from what you're willing to sacrifice for others. The mountain was waiting, and Sarah Martinez was about to redefine what it meant to be a Marine. The week leading up to the Big Sur expedition revealed sides of Sarah Martinez that her fellow veterans had never bothered to notice. While they focused on her dietary choices and quiet demeanor, they missed the subtle signs of a warrior who had simply chosen to channel her strength differently. At the Humane Society, Dr. Rebecca Mills watched Sarah work with a particularly challenging case, a pit bull mix named Titan who'd been seized from a dog fighting ring. The animal had been so traumatized that 3 previous handlers had recommended immediate euthanasia. His file read like a horror story: aggressive toward humans, food possessive, unable to be touched without sedation. Yet here was Sarah moving through Titan's rehabilitation with the patience of a saint and the strategic thinking of a general. Most people would have given up on him by now, Dr. Mills observed, watching through the kennel window as Sarah sat motionless beside the massive dog, who had finally stopped snarling long enough to accept a treat from her outstretched hand. "He just needs to remember that not all humans are enemies," Sarah replied softly, never taking her eyes off Titan. "Trust has to be rebuilt one moment at a time. You can't force it, you can't rush it, and you can't let your own fear contaminate the process." What Dr. Mills didn't fully understand was that Sarah was speaking from experience that went far beyond animal training. She was drawing on lessons learned in Afghan villages where one wrong move, one misread signal, one moment of impatience could turn potential allies into deadly enemies. The same skills that had helped her navigate complex tribal politics in Kandahar province were now helping her heal a broken animal spirit. "The shelter's insurance company isn't going to like this," Dr. Mills warned. "If he bites someone, if something goes wrong... Sarah finally looked up, and for just a moment, Dr. Mills caught a glimpse of something steel-hard behind those gentle brown eyes. "He won't bite," Sarah said with the kind of quiet certainty that came from someone who'd made life-or-death decisions in combat zones. "I know what I'm doing." That same certainty manifested in other ways throughout the week. During her lunch break, Sarah often used the shelter's small gym to maintain her fitness routine. Unlike the aggressive weightlifting sessions favored by Marines like Tommy Rodriguez, her workouts were methodical, functional, focused on endurance rather than bulk. She moved through complex bodyweight exercises with fluid precision, pistol squats that required extraordinary balance and strength, pull-ups performed with such control that she seemed to float rather than strain, planks held for minutes at a time while her breathing remained perfectly steady. Kevin Walsh, the facilities manager, had been a Navy SEAL before taking the civilian job, and he recognized elite-level fitness when he saw it. "You know," he mentioned to Sarah one afternoon as she finished a particularly impressive set of muscle-ups, "I've seen a lot of people work out over the years. You move like someone who's had serious training." Sarah toweled off her hands, considering. Her response, "The Corps taught me to take care of my body. I just never stopped." But it was more than just physical fitness. Kevin had noticed the way Sarah positioned herself in any room, always with clear sightlines to exits, always aware of who was coming and going, always maintaining what military professionals called tactical awareness. He'd seen her reflexes kick in when a new volunteer accidentally dropped a metal food bowl, the way she'd instantly assess the sound for threat level before relaxing. These weren't the habits of someone who'd sat behind a desk during their military service. "What was your MOS?" Kevin asked, using the military abbreviation for job specialty. "Oh, 311, Sarah replied without hesitation. "Rifleman." Kevin's eyebrows rose slightly. "Infantry. Combat arms." The job classification that put Marines on the front lines, in the most dangerous situations, where split-second decisions and physical courage meant the difference between coming home or coming home in a box. Suddenly, her calm confidence made perfect sense. The next day, Sarah's true capabilities revealed themselves in an unexpected way. Maria Santos, the volunteer who'd been amazed by Sarah's work with aggressive dogs, was struggling to move a shipment of 50-pound dog food bags from the delivery truck to the storage room. The bags were awkward, heavy, and the delivery driver had stacked them carelessly in the truck bed. "I can call Kevin to help with the forklift," Maria panted after wrestling. "With just 2 bags." "No need," Sarah said, hopping up into the truck bed. She began moving the bags with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural, using proper lifting technique but also something more, a kind of controlled explosiveness that suggested reserves of strength most people never developed. In 20 minutes, she'd single-handedly moved 40 bags, never appearing to strain, never breathing hard, never showing any sign that she was performing a task that would have challenged most men twice her size. When the delivery driver complimented her on the impressive display, Sarah just shrugged. "It's all about technique and pacing," she said. "Use your legs, keep your core tight, don't fight the weight." But Maria, who'd watched the entire performance, recognized something beyond good technique. This was strength born of necessity, developed through years of carrying heavy equipment across difficult terrain, of hauling wounded teammates to safety, of performing physically demanding tasks under the kind of pressure that most people couldn't imagine. That evening, Sarah received a text from Mike Rodriguez, the younger Marine who'd spoken up for her during Jake Morrison's harassment. "Hey, heard from Kevin Walsh that you're pretty impressive in the gym. Want to get a workout in before the camping trip? Could use a training partner." Sarah smiled as she typed back, "Sure. Fair warning though, I don't go easy on anyone." When they met at a local CrossFit gym the next morning, Mike quickly discovered that Sarah's warning hadn't been empty boasting. She moved through the workout with relentless efficiency, maintaining perfect form even as the weights increased and the repetitions multiplied. During a particularly brutal series of burpees and mountain climbers, Mike found himself struggling to keep pace with someone he'd unconsciously categorized as the weak link in their group. "Jesus, Martinez," he gasped during a brief rest period. "Where'd you learn to train like this?" "2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines," she replied, barely breathing hard. "Patrol base in Sangin District. When you're carrying 60 pounds of gear through 120-degree heat, you learn to optimize everything: your breathing, your movement, your energy systems. Efficiency becomes survival. Mike stared at her with new respect. Sangin district had been one of the most violent areas in Afghanistan, a place where Marines faced daily contact with Taliban fighters, where survival required not just courage, but exceptional physical and mental toughness. The woman Jake Morrison dismissed as weak had served in some of the heaviest fighting of the entire war. How many deployments? Mike asked. 3, Iraq twice, Afghanistan once. Sarah began preparing. For the next set of exercises, her movements economic and precise. Ramadi in 08, Fallujah in 09, Sangin in 11. Each location name carried weight in the Marine Corps' community. These weren't rear echelon assignments or safe bases. They were places where Marines died, where every day brought new tests of courage and competence. Sarah Martinez had passed those tests repeatedly, in conditions that would have broken many of the men who now questioned her strength. As they finished their workout, Mike found himself reevaluating everything he thought he knew about his fellow veteran. The quiet woman who ate quinoa salads and spoke softly had served in the deadliest places on earth, had earned her place in the brotherhood through blood and sacrifice, had proven her worth in ways that gym exercises and camping trips could never measure. Jake Morrison has no idea who he's messing with, does he? Mike said as they collected their gear. Sarah's smile was enigmatic, carrying hints of knowledge and experience that most people would never possess. I guess we'll find out this weekend. In 48 hours, in the mountains of Big Sur, the question of Sarah Martinez's strength would be answered definitively. But the answer wouldn't come in the form her critics expected. It would come when 3 Marines lay bleeding on a mountain trail, when conventional strength had failed, when the only thing standing between life and death was the kind of courage that had nothing to do with protein consumption and everything to do with the warrior spirit that burned quietly in Sarah's heart. The parking lot of VFW Post 2563 buzzed with pre-dawn activity as 23 Marines loaded gear into a convoy of pickup trucks and SUVs. The October air carried the crisp promise of autumn in the mountains, and excitement mixed with nervous energy as the group prepared for their weekend expedition to Big Sur. Headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating faces that ranged from eager anticipation to grim determination. Jake Morrison stood near his massive Ford F350, clipboard in hand, conducting what he'd termed a gear inspection, but what felt more like an opportunity to assert his dominance one final time before they hit the road. His truck bed was loaded with enough equipment to supply a small military outpost coolers full of meat, camping gear that looked like it had come straight from a military surplus store, and a rifle case that suggested he took his role as trip leader very seriously. "Rodriguez, you bring that portable grill like I asked?" Jake called out to Tommy, who was struggling to fit his beer cooler into an already overloaded Toyota Tacoma. "Got it. Plus charcoal for both nights," Tommy replied, breathing hard from the exertion. "This is going to be epic, man. Just like the old days." Sarah arrived in her modest Honda Civic just as Jake was beginning his impromptu inspection of everyone's equipment. She'd packed light, a single backpack containing her sleeping bag, minimal clothing, and food for the weekend. Her gear was functional rather than flashy, chosen for efficiency over appearance, every item serving multiple purposes. Well, Jake announced loudly enough for the entire parking lot to hear. "Look who decided to show up. Martinez, let's see what you've packed for our little adventure." The group gathered around as Sarah opened her backpack, and Jake immediately seized on what he saw as evidence of her inadequacy. "Where's your tent?" he demanded. "I brought a tarp and sleeping bag. I'll sleep under the stars," Sarah replied calmly. Jake's laugh was harsh in the pre-dawn air. "You're gonna freeze your ass off up there. October in Big Sur isn't exactly beach weather." He rummaged through her pack, pulling out containers of prepared food. "And what's this? Lentil soup? Quinoa salad? Jesus, Martinez, we're going camping." Not to some hippie health retreat. I brought enough for the weekend, Sarah said, neither defensive nor apologetic. I won't be a burden on anyone. Burden. Jake repeated the word like it tasted bad. That's exactly what I'm worried about. When the temperature drops and you're shivering in that sleeping bag, when you're weak from eating rabbit food, who do you think is going to have to take care of you? Mike Rodriguez stepped forward, his jaw tight with frustration. Jake, enough. She's here. She's prepared. Let's just get on the road. But Jake wasn't finished making his point. This is exactly the kind of thinking that gets people hurt in the wilderness. Individual preparation affects group safety. When someone makes poor choices, everyone pays the price. Corporal Alex Thompson rolled his wheelchair closer to the group, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd learned about real consequences the hard way. You know what gets people hurt? Focusing on the wrong things. Sarah's gear looks fine to me. The tension in the parking lot was palpable. 23 veterans divided between those who supported Jake's aggressive leadership style and those who were beginning to question whether his behavior had crossed the line from concern into harassment. Sarah stood at the center of it all, calm and composed despite being the target of what amounted to public humiliation. Robert Sterling, the official organizer of the trip, finally intervened. All right, everyone, we need to get moving if we want to make it to the trailhead by 8. Jake, you're leading Convoy 1 with Rodriguez, Dalton, and Martinez. Mike, you've got Convoy 2 with Thompson and Walsh. The assignment was clearly intentional, putting Sarah in Jake's vehicle ensured that the tension would continue during the 3-hour drive to Big Sur. As they loaded into the F-350, Jake made sure Sarah understood the hierarchy. You sit in back, he ordered. Tommy gets shotgun. The drive through the pre-dawn darkness of Highway 101 gave Jake ample opportunity to continue his campaign of psychological warfare, with Tommy Rodriguez as his eager audience and Sarah trapped. In the back seat, he regaled them with stories of his military service, each tale carefully chosen to emphasize the importance of strength, aggression, and traditional Marine Corps values. Fallujah, 2004, Jake began, his eyes meeting Sarah's in the rearview mirror. We had this one Lance Corporal, skinny kid from Oregon, thought he was tough because he could run fast. Well, when the shit hit the fan, when we needed someone to carry wounded Marines out of a kill zone, that boy folded like a cheap tent. Sometimes you don't know who someone really is until they're tested. The implication was clear, and Sarah understood that this story, like most of Jake's narratives, was less about historical accuracy than about establishing dominance. She'd heard variations of this tale before, usually told by men who needed to prove their worth through other people's failures. What happened to him? Tommy asked, playing his role as the appreciative audience. Transferred out, Jake replied with satisfaction. Command realized he wasn't Marine material. Some people just don't have what it takes when push comes to shove. As Highway 101 gave way to the winding mountain roads leading into Big Sur, the landscape began to change dramatically. Rolling hills covered in golden grass gave way to steep ridges topped with ancient redwoods, and the early morning sun painted the mountains in shades of amber and gold that took Sarah's breath away. This was why she'd signed up for the trip, not for Jake Morrison's approval, but for this connection to something larger than herself. This reminder that beauty and peace still existed in a world that often felt dominated by conflict and aggression. Beautiful country, she said softly, more to herself than to her companions. Pretty enough, Jake conceded, but don't let it fool you. These mountains will kill you if you're not prepared. Weather can change in minutes, trails can wash out, people get lost and die up here every year. This isn't some nature documentary, it's serious business. The final hour of the drive took them deep into Los Padres National Forest, where cell phone coverage disappeared and civilization felt increasingly remote. Sarah watched the terrain with the analytical eye of someone who'd operated in hostile environments, noting escape routes, water sources, and natural defensive positions. Old habits died hard, and part of her mind automatically cataloged the tactical significance of the landscape they were entering. When they finally reached the trailhead parking area, the convoy gathered for final preparations. The plan was ambitious, a challenging 10-mile hike to a remote campsite, 2 nights under the stars, and a different route back to the vehicles. The trail they'd chosen was known for its difficulty, with steep ascents, rocky terrain, and limited water sources. "Last chance to back out," Jake announced as the group shouldered their packs. "Once we start up that mountain, there's no easy way down." Sarah adjusted her pack straps and checked her boots one final time. Around her, 22 other Marines were making similar preparations, but she could feel the weight of their collective doubt pressing down on her like a physical force. They expected her to fail, to prove Jake Morrison right, to validate their assumptions about strength and weakness. What none of them knew was that this mountain, this trail, this weekend that Jake had designed as a test of her worthiness, would become the stage for a demonstration of courage that would redefine their understanding of what it meant to be a Marine. In less than 24 hours, 3 of these men would be fighting for their lives, and the woman they'd dismissed as weak would prove that true strength has nothing to do with what you eat, and everything to do with what you're willing to sacrifice. For others, the mountain was calling, and Sarah Martinez was ready to answer. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first day of hiking passed without major incident, though Jake Morrison made sure to maintain his campaign of subtle harassment throughout the 10-mile trek to their campsite. He set a punishing pace, one clearly designed to test Sarah's endurance, and made pointed comments whenever the group stopped for water breaks. "Everyone keeping up okay back there?" He'd call out, his eyes finding Sarah in the group. "Don't want anyone falling behind on account of poor nutrition choices." But Sarah had maintained her position in the middle of the pack without apparent effort, her breathing steady, her pace consistent. Mike Rodriguez, hiking nearby, noticed that she seemed to be holding back rather than struggling, as if she were deliberately avoiding showing her true capabilities. When Tommy Rodriguez stumbled on a loose rock section and needed help with his oversized pack, Sarah was the first to offer assistance, steadying him with a grip that suggested reserves of strength Jake's assessment had completely missed. Campsite Jake had chosen was spectacular, a small clearing surrounded by towering redwoods, with a stream running nearby and views of the Pacific Ocean visible through gaps in the canopy. As the group set up their tents and prepared for the evening, the natural beauty of the location seemed to soften some of the interpersonal tensions that had marked the day's hike. Sarah had been right about sleeping under the stars, while others struggled with tent stakes and guy lines in the fading light. She simply rolled out her sleeping bag on a flat section of ground, using her tarp as a ground cover. Her setup was minimalist but efficient, and she was relaxing by the stream with a cup of herbal tea while others were still wrestling with their equipment. "Smart," said Alex Thompson, rolling his wheelchair as close to Sarah's setup as the terrain would allow. "Sometimes simple is better." The evening meal reinforced the social divisions Jake had worked so hard to establish. The group gathered around a central fire, sharing stories and passing around bottles of beer, while steaks sizzled on Tommy's portable grill. Sarah sat slightly apart, eating her lentil soup and quinoa salad, politely declining offers to share the group meal. "You sure you don't want some real food?" Rick Dalton asked, waving a perfectly grilled ribeye in her direction. "This is what camping's all about." "I'm good, thanks," Sarah replied with a smile. "This is exactly what I need." Jake seized the moment to make another point. "See, this is what I'm talking about. Group cohesion, shared experiences, common purpose. When you separate yourself, when you insist on being different, it affects the whole team dynamic." Private Danny Walsh, the youngest member of the group, spoke up unexpectedly. Maybe diversity makes us stronger? Different perspectives, different capabilities. The comment drew a sharp look from Jake, but before he could respond, Sergeant Mike Rodriguez stood up and stretched. Anyone want to take a night hike? Check out the view from that ridge we passed about a mile back. Several hands went up, including Sarah's. The group that formed was interesting. Mike, Danny, Alex Thompson, who would wait at the base of the ridge, and surprisingly, Tommy Rodriguez and Rick Dalton. Jake declined, citing the need to maintain camp security, but his real motivation seemed to be avoiding any activity where Sarah might demonstrate competence. The night hike proved to be a revelation. Away from Jake's aggressive leadership and constant commentary, the group dynamic shifted dramatically. Sarah moved through the darkness with confident grace, her night vision and trail sense clearly superior to most of the others. When Tommy stumbled in a particularly rocky section, she steadied him with the kind of casual strength that suggested significant reserves. "Jesus, Martinez," Tommy whispered as they navigated a steep section of trail. "You move like a ghost out here." "Infantry training," she replied simply. "You learn to move quietly when your life depends on it." The ridge offered spectacular views of the coastline, with the lights of distant cities twinkling like stars below them. For 30 minutes the small group sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about service, sacrifice, and the beauty of the natural world they'd fought to protect. "This is why I love these trips," Mike said quietly. "Reminds you what really matters." The hike back to camp was uneventful, but Sarah noticed something that the others missed. The weather was changing. The wind had shifted, carrying the smell of rain from the ocean, and the temperature was dropping faster than the forecast had predicted. Her meteorological instincts, honed by years of military operations where weather could mean the difference between mission success and disaster, told her that the next day might bring challenges beyond what the group had prepared for. Back at camp, Jake was holding court around the fire, regaling the remaining Marines with another story about military toughness and the importance of traditional values. The night hikers rejoined the group quietly, but Sarah could sense that something had shifted in the dynamic. Tommy and Rick were looking at her differently, with a recognition that hadn't been there before. The group began turning in around 10 o'clock, with various levels of preparation for the dropping temperature. Sarah had been right about her setup. Tarp and sleeping bag combination kept her warm and dry, while several tent campers found themselves struggling with condensation and inadequate insulation. At 3:17 a.m., Sarah's eyes opened instantly, her combat-trained senses picking up something wrong in the sounds of the night. The wind had intensified dramatically, and she could hear the crack and groan of stressed trees in the surrounding forest. Rain was falling steadily, and the temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees from when they'd gone to sleep. She lay still for several minutes, listening, assessing, her mind automatically running through contingency plans. This wasn't the gentle autumn weather they'd been promised. This was the kind of sudden storm system that could turn a pleasant camping trip into a survival situation. The first scream came at 3:24 a.m. Sarah was on her feet instantly, her body moving before her conscious mind had fully processed the sound. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the camp, someone was in serious trouble. The scream came again, definitely human, definitely terrified, coming from the direction of the trail they'd used for their night hike. "Help! Oh God, help us!" The voice was Danny Walsh's, high-pitched with panic and pain. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and ran toward the sound, her bare feet finding purchase on the wet ground with the sure-footedness of someone who'd moved through hostile territory in darkness. Behind her, she could hear the camp coming alive, confused voices, the rustle of people struggling out of sleeping bags. Jake Morrison's voice demanding to know what was happening. She found Danny 50 yards from camp, kneeling beside two motionless figures on the trail. In the harsh beam of her flashlight, Sarah immediately understood what had happened. A massive redwood, its root system compromised by the sudden rainfall and high winds, had fallen across the trail. Mike Rodriguez and Rick Dalton had been caught underneath, pinned by branches and bleeding heavily. They went out to check the weather, Danny babbled, his voice shaking with shock. The tree just came down. I couldn't move it. I couldn't. Sarah was already moving, her training taking over as she assessed the casualties. Mike was conscious but trapped by a large branch across his legs, blood soaking through his pants from what looked like a compound fracture. Rick was unconscious, a head wound bleeding profusely, his breathing shallow and irregular. Both men needed immediate medical attention, the kind that was hours away through difficult terrain and worsening weather conditions. Danny, go back to camp, Sarah ordered, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions. Tell Jake we need everyone up here now, and have someone try to get a cell signal. We need to call for help. As Danny stumbled back toward camp, Sarah knelt beside the wounded Marines and began the kind of triage assessment she'd performed too many times in Afghanistan. The tree was too heavy to move without equipment they didn't have. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, making helicopter evacuation unlikely. The nearest road was 5 miles away, through increasingly treacherous terrain. In that moment, as rain soaked through her clothes and the wind howled through the trees above Sarah, Martinez realized that the test Jake Morrison had designed for her was about to become very real. But it wouldn't be a test of whether she could keep up with the group or contribute to team cohesion. It would be a test of whether she could save the lives of men who had questioned her strength, doubted her capabilities, and dismissed her as a liability. The mountain had delivered its challenge, and Sarah Martinez was about to prove what kind of Marine she really was. The beam of Jake Morrison's flashlight cut through the darkness as he arrived at the scene, followed by the rest of the group stumbling through the rain and wind. What he saw stopped him cold, a massive redwood, easily 4 feet in diameter, lying across the trail with 2 of his Marines trapped beneath its branches. The tree had fallen with such force that it had gouged a deep furrow in the earth, and the smell of fresh sap mixed with the metallic scent of blood. Jesus Christ! Tommy Rodriguez breathed, his face pale in the harsh LED light. How the hell are we gonna move that thing? Sarah looked up from where she knelt beside Rick Dalton, her hands pressed against a head wound that was bleeding more heavily than she liked. We're not, she said simply. It weighs at least 10 tons. We need to extract them from underneath and get them to medical care. Jake's leadership instincts kicked in, though his voice carried an edge of panic that Sarah had learned to recognize in inexperienced officers facing their first real crisis. Okay, everyone stay calm. Tommy, try to get a cell signal from that ridge. Alex, see if your satellite communicator works in this weather. We need to call for help. Already tried, Alex. Thompson called from his wheelchair, holding up a small device. Storm's interfering with everything. No signal, no GPS, no way to communicate with the outside. The reality of their situation settled over the group like a suffocating blanket. They were completely cut off, miles from the nearest road, with 2 severely injured Marines and weather conditions that made helicopter evacuation impossible, even if they could call for help. The rain was falling harder now, turning the trail into a muddy stream, and the wind was strong enough to make standing difficult. Sarah continued her assessment of the wounded, her movements methodical and professional despite the deteriorating conditions. Mike Rodriguez was conscious but in significant pain, his left leg clearly broken and possibly his right as well. Rick Dalton remained unconscious, his breathing shallow, showing signs of a serious head injury that could prove fatal without immediate medical intervention. Martinez, what's your assessment? Jake asked, his usual condescension replaced by genuine concern. Mike's got compound fractures in both legs, possible internal bleeding. Rick's got a severe head injury, likely concussion, possibly skull fracture. They both need a trauma center, and they need it now. Sarah's voice was steady, clinical, carrying the authority of someone who'd performed battlefield medicine under fire. Every minute we delay decreases their chances of survival. So what do we do? Danny Walsh asked, his voice high with panic. We can't move that tree. We can't call for help. We can't. We carry them out, Sarah said quietly. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain hitting leaves and Rick Dalton's labored breathing. Tommy Rodriguez was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. Carry them? 5 miles? Through this weather? He gestured at the storm raging around them. Even if we could, it would take hours. Multiple trips. We don't have enough people. Jake's mind was working through the tactical problem, but coming up empty. She's right that we need to get them out of here, but the logistics are impossible. 2 wounded Marines, rough terrain, limited visibility, deteriorating weather conditions. We'd need a full squad of combat-ready Marines to attempt something like this. Sarah stood slowly, water streaming from her soaked clothing, and when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet certainty that cut through the group's growing panic. I can do it. The statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about physics, about human limitations, about what a woman who ate quinoa and lentils could possibly accomplish in a life-or-death situation. What do you mean you can do it? Jake demanded. I mean I can carry them out, one at a time. Mike first, because he's stable but deteriorating. Then come back for Rick. Sarah was already moving, kneeling beside Mike to begin fashioning an improvised carrying harness from paracord she'd pulled from her pack. The trail's treacherous, but it's not impossible. I've moved wounded Marines before. Tommy Rodriguez laughed, but it was a sound edged with hysteria. Martinez, no offense, but you weigh maybe 120 soaking wet. Mike's got to be 180, 190. Rick's probably 200. The physics just don't work. Physics work. Fine, Sarah replied, her hands steady as she tested the strength of her improvised harness. It's about leverage, balance, and understanding how to distribute weight. Firefighters do it all the time. Jake stepped closer, his flashlight beam fixed on Sarah's face. For the first time since he'd known her, he was seeing past his own prejudices and really looking at the woman who'd volunteered for what amounted to a suicide mission. Even if you could somehow carry them, 5 miles through this terrain would take hours. You'd be exhausted after the first mile. Maybe, Sarah acknowledged, never pausing in her preparations, but they'll be dead if we wait for better options. Alex. Thompson rolled his wheelchair as close as the terrain would allow. Sarah, I've seen enough battlefield medicine to know what you're talking about. But Jake's right about the physical demands. This isn't just about strength, it's about endurance. Over distance and terrible conditions. Sarah looked up from her work, and for a moment, the group saw something in her eyes that they'd never noticed before, a hardness that spoke of decisions made under fire, of responsibilities accepted when others had failed, of a warrior's spirit that had been forged in places where hesitation meant death. Sengan District, 2011, she said quietly. Patrol base was overrun. Medevac couldn't get through. I carried Staff Sergeant Williams 3 clicks through Taliban territory with a bullet in my shoulder. He lived. She paused, her gaze moving from face to face around the circle. Corporal Thompson carried me 2 clicks. When I took shrapnel from an IED, he saved my life. The rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear the ominous crack of another tree under stress. Time was running out, and the weather was getting worse by the minute. That's what Marines do, Sarah continued, securing the last knot in her harness system. We don't leave people behind. We don't accept failure when lives are on the line. And we sure as hell don't let good Marines die because the mission looks impossible. Jake Morrison stood in the rain, watching this woman he'd dismissed as weak prepare to attempt something that challenged every assumption he'd ever made about strength, courage, and what it meant to be a Marine. The evidence of his own inadequacy was overwhelming. Faced with the same crisis, his leadership had produced nothing but panic and excuses. "How can we help?" he asked finally, the question costing him everything his ego had built over the years. Sarah looked up at him, water streaming down her face, and smiled, not with triumph or vindication, but with the grim satisfaction of someone who'd found their moment of truth. "Light the way," she said simply, "and be ready to move fast when I get back." As Sarah knelt beside Mike Rodriguez and began explaining what she was about to do, Jake Morrison realized that he was about to witness something that would haunt him for the rest of his life, not because it would prove him wrong, but because it would prove him irrelevant. The woman he'd mocked for her vegetarian diet was about to redefine heroism for every person present. The mountain was demanding everything she had, and Sarah Martinez was about to give it willingly. At 4:47 a.m., Sarah Martinez began what would become one of the most extraordinary rescue operations in Marine Corps' history. With Mike Rodriguez secured to her back using an improvised harness system that distributed his 185-pound frame across her shoulders and torso, she took her first steps into the storm-lashed darkness of the Big Sur wilderness. The initial 100 yards tested every assumption about human endurance and the limits of what one person could accomplish. Mike's weight pressed down on Sarah's frame like a crushing burden, each step requiring her to fight not just gravity, but the treacherous footing of a trail that had become a muddy stream. The rain had transformed the normally solid path into a slippery nightmare of loose rocks, hidden roots, and washouts that could send them both tumbling into the canyon below. "You sure about this, Martinez?" Mike whispered through gritted teeth, his voice tight with pain from his shattered legs. "This is insane." Sarah's response came in measured breaths, her voice steady despite the massive physical load she was carrying. "Talk ... to myself. Through worse." Each word was carefully timed with her breathing pattern, a technique she'd learned during her darkest days in Afghanistan when panic attacks had threatened to end her career. Just ... stay ... conscious. What the group back at camp couldn't see, what they couldn't understand, was that Sarah wasn't just carrying Mike Rodriguez. She was carrying the weight of every doubt, every dismissive comment, every assumption about her capabilities that had followed her through 3 years of veteran meetings. This wasn't just about proving her physical strength. It was about proving that strength comes in forms that men like Jake Morrison would never recognize. By the end of the first mile, Sarah had settled into a rhythm that seemed to defy human physiology. Her breathing remained controlled, her pace steady, her movement through the treacherous terrain fluid and purposeful. Mike Rodriguez, fighting to stay conscious despite the pain from his broken legs, began to understand that he was being carried by someone operating at a level of fitness and mental toughness that bordered on the supernatural. "Where'd you learn to do this?" he asked during one of Sarah's brief rest stops, where she knelt to redistribute his weight and check his condition. "Sanguine," she replied, using the minimum number of words necessary while her body recovered for the next push. "Carried ... wounded, out of kill zones. Different weight ... Same principles." The second mile nearly broke her. The trail climbed steeply here, switchbacking up a ridge that offered no protection from the wind and rain. Sarah's legs began to burn with lactic acid buildup, and her shoulder muscles screamed in protest against the constant pressure of Mike's weight. But she'd been here before, in the mountains of Afghanistan, carrying wounded Marines while Taliban fighters closed in. When stopping meant death for everyone involved, her mind began to drift, accessing memories that she usually kept locked away. Staff Sergeant Williams, unconscious and bleeding, carried 3 kilometers through enemy territory while insurgent rounds cracked overhead. Corporal Jenkins, his leg nearly severed by an IED blast, carried 2 kilometers to a landing zone while the base came under mortar attack. Each mission had taught her that the human body could endure far more than the mind believed possible, That true strength came not from muscle mass, but from the refusal to accept failure when lives were at stake. "Talk to me, Mike," she said during another rest stop, noting that his responses were becoming sluggish. "Stay with me." "I'm here," he replied weakly. "Just can't believe you're doing this. Marines don't leave Marines behind," Sarah said, rising to continue the journey. "Doesn't matter what anyone thinks about how we eat." The third mile was where Sarah Martinez transcended normal human limitations and entered a state that military psychologists call combat consciousness, a mental zone where pain becomes irrelevant, where exhaustion is simply another obstacle to overcome, where the mission becomes the only reality that matters. Her body moved through the darkness with mechanical precision, each step calculated for maximum efficiency, each breath carefully controlled to maintain the oxygen flow that kept her muscles functioning. Mike Rodriguez, drifting in and out of consciousness, would later describe the experience as being carried by a force of nature rather than a human being. "She moved like a machine," he would tell reporters months later. "Like nothing could stop her, like my weight was just another piece of equipment she was used to carrying." The fourth mile tested Sarah's navigation skills as much as her endurance. The storm had intensified, and visibility was reduced to the small circle illuminated by her headlamp. Several times she had to backtrack when the trail became impassable, adding precious minutes to a journey where every second counted. But her land navigation training, honed by years of operating in hostile territory where GPS signals were jammed and maps were unreliable, served her well. She moved through the wilderness with the confidence of someone who understood terrain, weather, and the subtle signs that marked safe passage. "Almost there," she whispered to Mike as they crested the final ridge. Below them, barely visible through the rain and darkness, were the lights of the parking area where their vehicles waited. 30 more minutes. Mike Rodriguez tried to respond but found that his voice had abandoned him. The pain from his broken legs had evolved into a constant, nauseating throb that made coherent thought nearly impossible. But through the haze of shock and trauma, he understood that he was witnessing something extraordinary, a demonstration of courage and capability that redefined his understanding of what made someone a warrior. At 6:23 a.m., after carrying Mike Rodriguez 5.2 miles through some of the most challenging terrain in California, Sarah Martinez stumbled into the parking area and gently lowered her burden beside Jake Morrison's truck. Her legs were shaking with exhaustion, her shoulders had long since gone numb, and her clothes were soaked through with rain and sweat. But her eyes remained clear, her voice steady as she called 911 on Alex Thompson's satellite phone. "This is former Corporal Sarah Martinez," she told the emergency dispatcher. "I have a Marine with multiple fractures who needs immediate medevac. GPS coordinates are..." She rattled off their location with military precision, then added, "I'm going back for a second casualty. 8 approximately 3 hours." Mike Rodriguez, lying in the back of the truck with blankets packed around him, grabbed Sarah's wrist as she prepared to leave. "You can't," he whispered. "You'll kill yourself. No one can do this twice." Sarah looked down at him, and Mike saw something in her eyes that he'd never seen before, not exhaustion or doubt, but a kind of fierce determination that seemed to burn with its own internal fire. "Rick's depending on me," she said simply. "And Marines don't quit." As she disappeared back into the storm-lashed darkness, Mike Rodriguez understood that he'd just been saved by someone whose strength had nothing to do with protein consumption, and everything to do with the warrior spirit that defined the very best of the Marine Corps. Sarah Martinez wasn't just carrying wounded Marines to safety. She was carrying the honor of everyone who'd ever worn the uniform the mountain had demanded. Everything she had, and she was prepared to give it twice. The second journey into the mountains tested Sarah Martinez in ways that the first rescue had only hinted at. Her body was already operating beyond normal human limits, her muscle glycogen stores depleted, her joints screaming in protest from the previous 5-mile trek with Mike Rodriguez on her back. But as she made her way through the storm-darkened wilderness toward the camp where Rick Dalton lay unconscious, Sarah discovered reserves of strength that even she hadn't known existed. At the campsite, she found a scene of barely controlled chaos. The remaining Marines had managed to extract Rick from underneath the fallen tree, but his condition had deteriorated significantly in the 2 hours since Sarah had begun her first rescue mission. Danny Walsh knelt beside the unconscious Marine, pressing a blood-soaked t-shirt against the head wound that continued to seep despite their best efforts at field dressing. "Thank God you're back," Danny said, his voice cracking with relief and exhaustion. "He's been unconscious the whole time, and his breathing's getting worse." Sarah dropped to her knees beside Rick, her trained eyes immediately assessing what had become a critical medical situation. His pulse was weak and thready, his skin pale and clammy despite the cold rain, and his breathing had developed the irregular pattern that emergency medics recognize as a sign of severe brain trauma. Without immediate surgical intervention, Rick Dalton was going to die on this mountain. How long? Jake Morrison asked, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by the desperate hope of a leader who'd watched his authority crumble in the face of genuine crisis. 90 minutes, Sarah replied, already beginning the process of rigging her carrying harness for a second impossible journey. Maybe less if his intracranial pressure keeps building. Tommy Rodriguez stared at her in disbelief. "Martinez, you just carried Mike 5 miles through hell. You're exhausted, you're soaked, you're hypothermic. You can't possibly—" "I can," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying a finality that silenced all protest. "And I will." What happened next would be talked about in Marine Corps circles for decades. Sarah Martinez, operating on pure willpower and a warrior's determination that transcended physical limitations, lifted Rick Dalton's 200-pound frame onto her back and began the second, most challenging rescue mission in the history of the Corps. This time, the journey was different. Where the first trek had been about proving her capabilities to herself and others, the second became a meditation on sacrifice, endurance, and the true meaning of military brotherhood. Every step was agony, every breath a conscious decision to continue when her body begged her to stop. Her legs trembled with each placement, her shoulders had long since gone numb, and her vision occasionally blurred from exhaustion and dehydration. But Sarah Martinez had learned something about herself during those 3 deployments that even she had forgotten in the comfortable routine of civilian life. She had learned that there are moments when ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things, when the mission becomes more important than personal comfort, when the lives of others matter more than your own limitations. At the 2-mile mark, she stumbled and nearly fell, Rick's unconscious weight shifting dangerously on her back. For a moment, kneeling in the mud with rain streaming down her face, Sarah wondered if Jake Morrison had been right all along. Maybe she was too weak, too different, too soft for this kind of responsibility. Then she heard Rick's labored breathing, felt the warmth of his body against her back, and remembered the faces of every Marine she'd served with who hadn't made it home. Staff Sergeant Williams, Corporal Jenkins, Lance Corporal Martinez, different Martinez, no relation, who died in her arms outside Kandahar when the medevac couldn't reach them in time. Sarah Martinez stood up and kept walking. By the 4-mile mark, she was moving through a landscape that existed somewhere between reality and hallucination. The trail beneath her feet seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness, and her body had transcended normal sensory input to operate on pure determination. She found herself talking to Rick, though she wasn't sure if the words were spoken aloud or existed only in her mind. "Stay with me, Marine," she whispered. "We're almost home, just a little further." When the parking area finally came into view, Sarah saw a scene that looked like something from a movie. Emergency vehicles filled the lot, ambulances, fire trucks, a helicopter with its rotors spinning in preparation for takeoff. Paramedics rushed toward her as she staggered out of the tree line, and she felt gentle hands helping to lower Rick Dalton onto a stretcher. "Ma'am, you need medical attention," one of the EMTs said, noting her hypothermic symptoms and obvious exhaustion. "I'm fine," Sarah replied automatically, though her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. "How's Mike?" "Stable and en route to trauma surgery," the paramedic replied. "You saved his life." As Rick Dalton was loaded into the helicopter, one of the flight medics approached Sarah with an expression of professional amazement. "Ma'am, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just accomplished. Carrying 2 men 5 miles each through that terrain in these conditions. It's not humanly possible." Sarah was about to respond when she heard Jake Morrison's voice behind her. "It is if you're Sarah Martinez." She turned to find not just Jake, but the entire group of Marines who'd witnessed her departure and return. Their faces showed a mixture of awe, shame, and something approaching reverence. Tommy Rodriguez was openly weeping, whether from relief or recognition of his own inadequacy. Sarah couldn't tell. "I owe you an apology," Jake said, his voice barely audible over the helicopter rotors. "I owe all of you an apology." He gestured toward the group. "I was wrong about everything. About strength, about what makes a Marine, about what really matters." Danny Walsh stepped forward, his young face streaked with tears and rain. "Sarah, we looked you up while you were gone. Your service record, the medals, the commendations, He struggled to find words. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Sarah looked around at the faces of her fellow veterans men who'd spent 3 years questioning her worth, doubting her capabilities, making assumptions based on dietary choices and gentle demeanor. She could have been angry, could have used this moment to humiliate them as they had humiliated her. Instead, she felt only exhaustion and a deep sadness for the time they'd all wasted. "Because it didn't matter what I'd done before," she said quietly. "What mattered was what I was willing to do when it counted." Alex Thompson rolled his wheelchair closer, his expression solemn. 3 tours, 2 Purple Hearts, Navy Cross for Valor under fire. You're a goddamn legend, and we've been treating you like a Marine who made different choices," Sarah finished. "Which is exactly what I am." The helicopter lifted off, carrying Rick Dalton toward the trauma center where surgeons would work for 6 hours to save his life. As the sound of rotors faded into the storm, Sarah Martinez stood in the parking lot surrounded by Marines who finally understood that strength comes in many forms, that heroism isn't measured by what you eat or how loudly you speak, but by what you're willing to sacrifice when others need you most. The mountain had tested all of them that night. Only one had answered the call without hesitation. The woman they'd mocked for her vegetarian diet had carried 3 wounded Marines to safety, redefined their understanding of courage, and reminded them all what it truly meant to be a Marine. The story of Sarah Martinez's impossible rescue mission spread through the veteran community like wildfire, but not in the way that modern viral stories typically unfold. This was different, deeper, more personal, carrying the weight of recognition that something truly extraordinary had taken place in the mountains of Big Sur within hours of the rescue. The emergency room at Monterey County Hospital had become an impromptu gathering place for Marines who'd driven from across California to check on their wounded brothers and to see for themselves the woman who'd carried them to safety. Mike Rodriguez, his legs immobilized in external fixation devices, held court from his hospital bed, telling anyone who would listen about the 5-mile journey that had saved his life. "She moved like a ghost," he repeated to each new visitor, his voice still carrying notes of disbelief. 120 pounds soaking wet, carrying my fat ass through terrain that would challenge a pack mule. Every time I thought she might break, she just kept going. Rick Dalton's condition remained critical. The neurosurgeons had worked through the night to relieve pressure on his brain, but his vital signs were stable, and the doctors credited Sarah's quick decision-making. and rapid evacuation with saving his life. Another hour delay. Dr. Patricia Chun told the assembled Marines, and Mr. Dalton would have suffered irreversible brain damage or death. Sarah herself had been treated for exhaustion, dehydration, and mild hypothermia, but she'd refused to stay overnight for observation. By noon the following day, she was back at the San Diego Humane Society, quietly returning to her work with traumatized animals as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Her supervisor, Kevin Walsh, found her in Kennel 12 with Titan, the aggressive German Shepherd who'd been her ongoing project. "You know there are reporters calling here," Kevin said, watching as the formerly vicious dog rested his massive head against Sarah's shoulder. CNN, Fox News, local stations. Everyone wants to talk to the woman who carried 3 Marines to safety. Sarah continued her gentle ministrations to Titan's coat, her movements patient and methodical. "I carried 2 Marines," she corrected quietly. "And they weren't stories for reporters. They were Marines who needed help." But the story had taken on a life of its own, amplified by social media posts from witnesses and the natural human fascination with acts of extraordinary heroism. The Marine Corps' Public Affairs Office had been fielding calls from news organizations across the country, all wanting to interview the decorated veteran whose courage had redefined assumptions about strength and capability. Jake Morrison found himself in an uncomfortable position as reporters tracked down members of the Big Sur expedition. His 3 years of dismissive comments about Sarah's diet and capabilities had been witnessed by too many people to deny, and journalists were eager to explore the irony of the situation. The man who'd questioned her strength saved by the woman. He'd openly mocked. "I was wrong," he told Maria Santos of Channel 7 News, his usual bluster replaced by genuine humility. "Dead wrong about everything. Sarah Martinez is the finest Marine I've ever served with, and I spent 3 years too blind to see it." The interview, broadcast during the evening news, showed a broken man grappling with the reality of his own prejudices. When asked about Sarah's vegetarian diet, the source of so much of his harassment, Jake struggled to find words. "I thought strength meant one thing," he said finally. "I thought being a Marine meant fitting a certain image, eating certain foods, projecting a certain kind of toughness. Sarah Martinez taught me that real strength comes from character, not protein consumption. Real Marines don't judge each other by dietary choices. They judge each other by what they do when lives are on the line." The story resonated far beyond military circles. Dr. Amanda Foster, the Veterans Support Group facilitator, found herself fielding calls from other therapists and counselors who wanted to understand how someone could endure such systematic harassment while maintaining the grace and dignity that Sarah had shown throughout her ordeal. Sarah never responded to their provocations with anger or defensiveness. Dr. Foster explained to a gathering of VA mental health professionals. She simply continued being who she was: a healer, a protector, someone whose strength came from service rather than dominance. When the moment of truth arrived, that authentic strength proved infinitely more valuable than all the posturing and aggression in the world. The transformation in the Veteran Support Group was immediate and profound. Tommy Rodriguez, who'd been one of Sarah's most persistent tormentors, appeared at the next Thursday meeting with a prepared statement that he read with shaking hands. "I want to apologize to Sarah Martinez and to everyone in this group," he began, his voice barely audible. "For 3 years, I participated in behavior that was unworthy of a Marine, unworthy of a decent human being. I made assumptions based on ignorance and prejudice, and I contributed to an environment that drove away one of the finest people I've ever known." The group sat in stunned silence as Tommy continued. "Sarah Martinez embodied everything we claim. To value courage, sacrifice, loyalty, honor, and we mocked her because she ate differently than we did. We're supposed to be brothers and sisters in arms, but we treated her like an enemy. That ends now." Similar transformations were taking place throughout the veteran community as word of Sarah's heroism spread. Marine Corps League chapters across the country began examining their own cultures, questioning whether their definition of strength and brotherhood had become too narrow, too exclusionary. The woman who'd been dismissed as weak had sparked conversations about toxic masculinity, prejudice, and the true meaning of military values that reached the highest levels of military leadership. General Patricia Williams, Commandant of the Marine Corps, issued a statement that was distributed to every Marine unit worldwide. Corporal Martinez's actions remind us that heroism comes in many forms, that strength is not defined by appearance or dietary choices, and that the Corps is strongest when we judge Marines by their character and actions rather than their conformity to arbitrary standards. The media attention continued to build. Sarah's story appeared on the front page of the Washington Post under the headline, "The Quiet Hero: How a Mock Marine Redefined Courage." Time magazine featured her on their cover with the simple caption, "Strength." The Today Show, "Good Morning America," and 60 Minutes all requested interviews, but Sarah Martinez remained focused on the work that had always defined her: healing, protecting, and serving others without fanfare or recognition. She continued her job at the animal shelter, continued attending veteran support group meetings, though the dynamic had changed completely, and continued living according to the values that had guided her through 3 combat deployments and 3 years of civilian harassment. "The real measure of this story," she told Dr. Foster during a private conversation, "isn't what I did on that mountain. It's whether people learn something about judging others, about the many different ways strength can manifest, about treating each other with respect regardless of our differences." When pressed by persistent reporters about her extraordinary feat of endurance and strength, Sarah's response was characteristically humble. Any Marine would have done the same thing. "We don't leave people behind. That's not about being vegetarian or carnivore, male or female, big or small. That's about being a Marine." The mountain had tested them all, but only Sarah Martinez had understood that the real test wasn't about physical capability, it was about character. In carrying 2 wounded Marines to safety, she'd carried something much more valuable, a reminder that true strength comes from service, that real courage is quiet, and that the most powerful warriors are often those who appear gentlest in times of peace. The people who'd mocked her diet would never make that mistake again. 6 months after the rescue that changed everything, Sarah Martinez stood before a packed auditorium at the Marine Corps University in Quantico, Virginia. The invitation to speak had come directly from the Commandant's office, part of a new initiative to examine leadership, inclusion, and the evolving definition of what it meant to be a Marine in the 21st century. But as Sarah looked out at the sea of uniforms active duty Marines, officers, senior enlisted leaders, she felt the same quiet confidence that had carried her through 3 combat deployments and 1 impossible rescue mission, her new position with the Veterans Crisis Prevention Foundation had brought opportunities she'd never imagined. The foundation, inspired by her story, had offered her a role developing programs for at-risk veterans, focusing specifically on those who felt marginalized or excluded from traditional veteran communities. It was work that combined her natural healing instincts with her hard-earned understanding of military culture, and it suited her perfectly. "When I enlisted in the Marine Corps 18 years ago," Sarah began, her voice carrying easily through the auditorium sound system, "I thought I knew what strength looked like. I thought Marines were supposed to be aggressive, loud, intimidating. I thought fitting in meant adopting a certain lifestyle, eating certain foods, projecting a certain image." She paused, letting her words sink in among an audience that included many Marines who'd built their identities around those exact assumptions. 3 years ago, I was attending veteran support group meetings where fellow Marines questioned my strength because I chose not to eat meat. They saw my dietary choices as weakness, my quiet demeanor as an inability to handle the harsh realities of military life. For 3 years, I endured comments, jokes, and outright harassment because I didn't fit their definition of what a Marine should be. In the third row, Colonel James Patterson, a career infantry officer, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sarah's story had become required reading at the Marine Corps Command and Staff College, but hearing it delivered in person carried a different impact. What they didn't know, what I had never felt the need to prove, was that I'd served 3 combat deployments, earned 2 Purple Hearts, and received the Navy Cross for actions under fire. My service record wasn't the point. The point was that they'd decided my worth based on superficial characteristics rather than character. Sarah clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing a photograph of Mike Rodriguez walking without assistance, fully recovered from his injuries. This is Mike Rodriguez today. The doctors said he'd never walk normally again after the compound fractures to both legs. They were wrong. Marines have a way of exceeding expectations when they're properly motivated. The second slide showed Rick Dalton in his Navy dress blues, standing at attention during a promotion ceremony. This is Rick Dalton, recently promoted to Staff Sergeant. The neurosurgeons weren't sure he'd survive his brain injury, let alone return to full duty. They underestimated the power of getting proper medical care in time. Sarah advanced to the next slide, which showed the group from the Big Sur expedition at a recent reunion. The transformation in their faces was obvious. Where once there had been smugness and prejudice, now there was humility and genuine respect. These Marines learned something on mountain that no amount of training could have taught them. They learned that strength comes in many forms, that courage isn't always loud, and that the people we're quickest to dismiss might be the ones we need most when crisis strikes. The auditorium was completely silent now, hundreds of Marines hanging on every word from a woman who'd redefined their understanding of heroism. Jake Morrison, the man who spent 3 years questioning my capabilities, now runs diversity and inclusion workshops for Marine Corps League chapters across the country. He tells his own story of prejudice and transformation, helping other veterans recognize their own biases before they drive away the very people who could strengthen their communities. Sarah's presentation continued for 40 minutes, weaving together lessons about leadership, inclusion, and the dangerous tendency to judge others based on surface characteristics. She spoke about the veteran suicide crisis, about the Marines, and soldiers who'd taken their own lives after being excluded from support networks because they didn't fit traditional stereotypes of military toughness. The Marine Corps is at its strongest when we judge each other by our actions, not our appearances. When we value character over conformity. When we recognize that the warrior spirit comes in many packages, some loud and aggressive, others quiet and determined. During the question and answer session that followed, a young lance corporal raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do we change cultures that have been established for decades? How do we get people to look past their assumptions?" Sarah smiled, remembering her own younger self struggling with similar questions. One person at a time, one conversation at a time, one act of courage at a time. You don't change hearts and minds through lectures or policies. You change them by being authentically yourself and letting your actions speak louder than other people's assumptions. After the presentation, Sarah was approached by General Patricia Williams, the commandant who'd issued the Corps-wide statement about her heroism. "Corporal Martinez, I wanted to thank you personally. Your story has sparked conversations throughout the Marine Corps about inclusion, about strength, about what kind of organization we want to be." "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah replied. "But the real credit goes to Mike and Rick for surviving, and to the Marines who had the courage to examine their own prejudices. Change is never easy, especially when it challenges fundamental assumptions about identity and belonging." As Sarah left Quantico that evening, driving south toward her new life in Virginia, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from invisible custodian to inspirational speaker. The animal shelter work continued. She volunteered at a local rescue organization on weekends, but her primary focus now was helping other veterans who felt marginalized, excluded, or judged for not fitting traditional military stereotypes. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mike Rodriguez. Saw the video of your Quantico speech. You're changing the world, one Marine at a time. Semper Fi. Another message came from Tommy Rodriguez. My daughter's joining the Marines next year. She's vegetarian too. Thank you for showing her that she belongs. Sarah Martinez had learned something profound on that mountain in Big Sur, something that went far beyond physical endurance or individual heroism. She'd learned that true strength isn't about proving yourself to others. It's about being authentically yourself and serving others, regardless of their opinion of you. The woman they'd mocked for her vegetarian diet had become a voice for inclusion, understanding, and the recognition that heroism comes in many forms. She'd proven that real Marines don't judge each other by dietary choices, lifestyle preferences, or superficial characteristics. Real Marines judge each other by what they do when others need help, by their willingness to serve, and by their commitment to the values that transcend individual differences. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage is simply being who you are without apology, in a world that constantly pressures you to be someone else. Sarah Martinez had found that courage on a mountain trail in the darkness, carrying wounded Marines to safety. But the real rescue, the one that mattered most, was rescuing the idea that strength comes in many forms, and that the core's is strongest when it embraces all of them. As Sarah's story reminds us, true strength doesn't announce itself with credentials and bravado. Sometimes it waits quietly in the shadows, in the hands that serve rather than command, in the hearts that have learned resilience through sacrifice. How many Sarah Martinez's walk among us unnoticed? How many gifts remain hidden because we're too quick to judge by appearances, too comfortable in our assumptions about who belongs where? Remember, sometimes the most extraordinary courage comes from the most unexpected places. The next time you're tempted to dismiss someone because they're different, because they don't fit your definition of strength or capability, pause and consider. What would happen if you needed their help? What would you discover about the true nature of heroism? The mountain is always waiting to test us all. The question isn't whether we're strong enough to carry others. It's whether we're wise enough to recognize strength in all its forms. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.